Welcome to Mathematics for Principles of Economics. The topic of this video is how do we interpret a supply and demand graph?
And the math behind the economics is reading graphs.
So here's an example of a supply and demand graph. In economics, the concepts of supply and demand are often displayed as graphs. So let's say that the graph above shows something like the supply and demand for slices of pizza per week. How could we use this graph to learn about things like quantity supplied, quantity demanded, equilibrium price and quantity, surpluses and shortages?
In order to answer those kinds of questions, we need to understand how to read graphs. So for these slides, I'm going to be using the economics context. So that is, I'm only going to be interested in graphs that appear here in the first quadrant, and I'm going to consistently be labeling my axes as P and Q, as one does when you're looking at the kinds of graphs we're discussing for the economics questions. So what if I had the demand curve shown here? What kinds of questions could I answer based on this demand curve? Well, the kinds of questions I could answer would be, what if the price for a certain product in this market were, say, $2,000 or let's say $4,000? If the price were $4,000, what would be the quantity supplied?
Demanded.
What would be the quantity demanded? Excuse me. The quantity demanded, in this case, I would go over until I hit the demand curve, and it looks to be that, say, about 200 items would be demanded by the consumer at a price of $4,000 in this market. What if the price were to go down to, say, $3,000? What would be the quantity demanded at a price of $3,000 by the consumers in this market? It looks like about 600 items would be demanded at a price of $3,000 if this were the demand curve in a given market. I can also look at a supply curve, and I can ask the same kinds of questions. If I had for a price of $4,000, what would the producer be willing to provide in this market? And I would go over until I hit the supply curve, and I would go down, and it looks to be about 800 items would be supplied by my producer at a price of $4,000 in this market. And what if the price were to go down to $3,000? Then I would again go over until I hit my supply curve, and it looks to be that about 600 items would be produced at a price of $3,000 in this given market. Another kind of question you can be asked, of course, is when would the supply and demand be the same? When would a given price in this market produce the same demand by consumers as the amount provided by my supplier, the quantity supplied? And in this case, it looks like the equilibrium point would be a price of $3,000 and a quantity supplied and demanded of 600 items.
Okay, let's go back to the question we asked earlier, interpreting the supply and demand graph we saw before. One question we can ask is, at what price does the quantity supplied equal the quantity demanded? And here we can see that's at a price of 3. Another way of stating this is, at what quantity does the price buyers are willing to pay equal the price sellers are willing to accept? And here we see that that quantity is 2. Those are equilibrium price and quantity. On the other hand, what if the price were $4? Here we see that the quantity demanded is equal to 0, but the quantity supplied is equal to 3. So in this case, we would have a surplus of 3 units. What if the price were $1? Here we see that the quantity supplied is equal to 0, but the quantity demanded is equal to 6. So in this case, we would have a shortage of 6 units. So other times that we need to interpret graphs, we actually graph functions all the time in economics. Some examples are with revenues, costs, profits, production, interest rates, income inequality, money supply, and so on.
Now we've learned how to use the math behind the economics to interpret supply and demand graphs. Thank you so much for listening.